I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Since it took power on January 20th, the Trump administration has engaged in what can only be described as an all-out assault on First Amendment rights and due process. It's attacking judges in the United States that have issued rulings that cite serious constitutional concerns over the administration's policy, particularly on deporting people. This administration has embarked on a sweeping campaign to try to force colleges and universities to hand over private records of students that have engaged in protests against the US-facilitated Israeli war on the Palestinians of Gaza. It is fighting to deport students because of their activism, because of their speech, including those who have legal permanent residency status in the United States or green cards, as in the now well-known case of Columbia University student Mahmoud Khalil. And it's not just that the administration is putting pressure on these universities. Colleges and universities, including Columbia, have capitulated instead of fighting. These are schools that have vast endowments, they have resources, they have lawyers, and yet they have folded in the face of the kind of pressure on private institutions that we have not seen in the United States since the McCarthy era. And some of this is being spearheaded by a congressional committee that is trying to compel private institutions to violate the constitutional rights of its students. Now, this is a White House that is filled with people who have claimed for years, the entire duration of the Biden presidency, that they were free speech people. They are the real free speech supporters. They were the ones against cancel culture. But in reality, this administration is the party that is trying to cancel constitutional rights. What they have done in just over 2 months in power is to implement tactics of a police state. The position of this administration is that the First Amendment doesn't actually apply to criticism of Israel or of the ideology of Zionism. Trump's administration is trying to circumvent the United States Constitution and to criminalize clearly protected speech in the service of a genocidal government, Israel, whose weapons and political support overwhelmingly come from the United States. Today, it's speech about Israel, and tomorrow it could be applied to a wide range of issues on which this government does not want to allow dissent. History has shown us time and again that when governments begin down this path, the path of this form of authoritarian criminalization of speech, that it spreads as fast as cancer. The Trump administration did not create the US position that speech critical of Israel somehow holds this special status. Democrats, too, have supported and implemented efforts to conflate anti-Israel speech with anti-Semitism. But what we're seeing now is the most extreme application of that principle. You might recall that back in February, the new Vice President, J.D. Vance, traveled to Germany, and he spoke at the Munich Security Conference. And at that conference, he railed against speech laws in Europe. Vance said, quote, "In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat." He also said that, quote, "Sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country," meaning the United States. And then J.D. Vance said, quote, "In Washington, there's a new sheriff in town. And under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree." Now, there are several points to address here. First, I agree with J.D. Vance's overarching statements about suppression of free speech in both the US and Europe. But J.D. Vance and this administration are a main reason that free speech is now being attacked and criminalized in the United States. They are waging a war against free speech precisely because they disagree with it, precisely because they do not want to allow dissent from the bipartisan US foreign policy consensus of funding, arming, and defending Israel's war of annihilation against the Palestinian people. These aren't free speech warriors. They are warriors against free speech. Now, secondly, J.D. Vance was technically correct that free speech is in retreat, but he will never, ever oppose the current single greatest campaign to suppress free speech in recent history inside of Europe. and that is the speech of people who oppose Israel's war on Gaza. In fact, J.D. Vance supports it, and he and Trump are attacking fundamental speech rights at this very moment inside of the United States. The tactics that they're using are firmly in line with what has become a longstanding German policy of putting support for Israel, no matter how heinous its crimes, above the basic free speech rights of its citizens and residents. Today, we're going to take an in-depth look at Germany and how it has weaponized the concept of anti-Semitism to stifle dissent and to suppress speech. Since October 7th and the launch of Israel's war against the Palestinians of Gaza, German police have issued criminal citations to thousands of people for speech crimes, including people who've chanted, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," including people who have labeled Israel's actions genocidal, including people who have compared Israel's conduct toward the Palestinians to the tactics of Nazi Germany against Jewish people. Now, some of the people who've been targeted by the German government are Jewish residents of Germany themselves. Some of them are even citizens of Israel. Now, imagine this, charging Jewish people in Germany with anti-Semitic hate speech because they're opposing a genocidal war. A large German bank at one point over the past 17 months actually froze the account of the activist group Jewish Voice for Just Peace in the Middle East, prompting that group to publicly ask if Germany is once again in the business of seizing Jewish assets. Germany has also targeted residents for deportation and has ignited a campaign of fear, particularly among Arab and Muslim residents of Germany. Many German media outlets have joined this frenzy, running tabloid headlines accusing Arab activists of being Hamas propagandists or even worse, operatives. More recently, Germany has begun trying to deport activists who hold European Union citizenship, people who have a clearly defined right to live in Germany. Among these are citizens of Ireland and Poland, and they're also trying to deport a US citizen for participating in protests against Israel's war. None of those people have been convicted of any crimes. German cultural institutions have canceled speeches of artists and others who have opposed Israel's war. Conferences featuring Palestinian speakers have been raided and shut down. Prominent figures have been barred from entering Germany because of their political views. In Berlin alone, as of today, there have been nearly 6,000 so-called crimes registered that relate to the wars in the Middle East, with an estimated 90% of them classified as anti-Israel. More than 1,200 of those relate to speech or signs held by demonstrators. The Berlin police say they're investigating more than 3,000 people for pro-Palestine related actions. At times, German authorities have banned chanting in Arabic at protests and have told demonstrators they may only use German or English language. At the heart of Germany's policy is a doctrine referred to as Staatsräson, or reason of state. In Germany, it is official policy that the defense of the Israeli state is a non-negotiable principle of the nation. That's what its leaders argue. In some areas of Germany, the government is asking applicants applying for citizenship if they support the right of the state of Israel to exist, and answering in the negative could be grounds for denial. Speech criticizing Israel is being criminalized, and Germany has spent the past 17 months shipping weapons to Israel, political support to Israel, legal support to Israel for its war. Germany's foreign minister, who's from the Green Party, Annalena Baerbock, has even defended the targeting of hospitals by the Israeli military. While the Trump administration has railed against Europe's speech laws, it's actually in the process of adopting what looks very similar to what I think can rightly be called Germany's extremist stance on speech regarding Israel. The US has long had its own bipartisan policy of unquestioning support for Israel no matter what it does, but now this White House is putting it clearly in the open. It's a two-way street. Both Germany and the US have fed off of each other's militant dedication to Israel and to portray criticism of Israel's actions as anti-Semitism. There is no clearer example of this nation-state level obsession with excusing the crimes of the Israeli government than Germany's dedication and the US dedication to Israel. Joining me now to discuss all of this is one of the most important lawyers in Germany who has spent the last 17 months challenging the German government's weaponization of speech laws. Alexander Gorski is a Berlin-based criminal defense and migration lawyer. He's also a partner with the European Legal Support Center. Alex, you and I have been in touch throughout the Israeli genocidal war against Gaza, and you've been filling me in on these cases that you've been fighting. You also represent a cross-section of people that are facing either deportation or other forms of prosecution in Germany related to activism against Israel's war. And you're currently, among your clients, you're part of the legal team representing these 3 EU citizens and an American citizen who are facing deportation, I believe, in just a couple of weeks. But I want to start by welcoming you to DropSite and thank you for being with us here.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
Let's begin with the really big picture of Staatsräson, its historical roots, and what it means and how it's been applied to these cases of speech and deportation in Germany.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeremy. I think it's essential to first analyze this state doctrine that Germany has adopted in order to understand what's happening. And in order to do that, we need to go back in time. In 1945, the war ended. The Nazis lost the war. And in 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in May of 49. But in the meantime, in 48, the Nakba took place, the so-called founding of the state of Israel took place. And obviously, for the Federal Republic of Germany or Western Germany, it was essential to be re-accepted into the group of Western nations that they aspire to be part of, especially to be once again in good touch with the United States. And the United States obviously needed Western Germany in its Cold War efforts. So in that time, we have a lot of negotiations going on between government officials from Western Germany and Israel that in the 1950s lead to a treaty of so-called reconciliation. And from there on, we have very close ties between Western Germany and Israel. And we have different motivation on each side. So Western Germany wants to be re-included into the group of Western nations. And Israel obviously has to make its position clear in the region. It has to fight wars. It has to fight the Palestinians. And so this very close relationship evolves, which benefits both sides, basically. And so from there on, the relationship between Israel and Germany, which a lot of times in popular culture and especially German culture is painted as one of moral reconciliation and of a reckoning with history, it's actually a relationship of interest that we saw here. From very early on, Western Germany provided Israel with arms for its wars. And Israel basically accepted Germany back into the nations of this world, which Germany obviously needed. So from there on, we have this very close and special relationship driven by interest on both sides. And this goes on through the decades until then in 2008, then Chancellor Angela Merkel spoke in front of the Israeli Knesset and first used this term Staatsräson, reason of state. And she said that the security of Israel is Germany's reason of state. So what does that mean? As your listeners and viewers might know, obviously, reason of state, it's not a legal concept. It's not in the Constitution. It's something metaphysical. It's something that it's a founding myth. It's something a lot of nations have. The US have it. Other nations have it as well. And Angela Merkel said that the security of Israel is the reason of state of Germany. So something above the law, something that drives the conduct of the state of Germany. And obviously, this ignores a lot of facts about the things that Israel was doing and that were harmful to its own security. First and foremost, the occupation, oppression, and dehumanization of the Palestinian people that has been going on since 48 and was obviously harshened by the occupation in 67. So from 2008 onwards, this reason of state doctrine took on a more important position within German exterior politics, but also in interior politics. Because at the same time, Jeremy, we see more pro-Palestinian activism happening in Germany, especially after 2008 and the 2010s, especially after the war in Gaza in 2014. I think for two reasons. The international solidarity movement with Palestine got bigger in general on the international scale, but also there was a lot of migration to Germany from people from Arab countries who were in solidarity with the cause of the Palestinians. So there was more vocal support for pro-Palestine issues, and the government responded with the reason of state saying, no, this is anti-Semitism. If you speak out for Palestine, if you speak out in an anti-Zionist way, this equals anti-Semitism. And so even before October 7th, we've seen demonstration bans, we've seen people being cancelled, people being cancelled in academia, in cultural events, and we saw the accusation of anti-Semitism leveled against anyone who would dare to speak out on what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And then October 7th happens. And I think this is very important because then again, Olaf Scholz, who is still chancellor, who won't be for much longer, stood up in front of the German parliament and said, the security of Israel is Germany's reason of state. And he also kept delivering arms and delivered even more arms. Even after October 7th, Germany is still the second biggest supplier of arms to Israel for its genocidal war on Gaza. And Olaf Scholz said, we have delivered weapons and we will deliver weapons. And any accusations of Israel committing a genocide, he just shrugged them off as being utterly ridiculous. And he did all of this while citing the reason of state. So the reason of state is something that comes across as a moral concept, but it's actually just a reflection of Germany's interests in its relationships with the state of Israel. And it's also used as a weapon against social movements, especially against those who speak out for Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, and this, there's such a similar or parallel dynamic to what happens in the United States and what happens in Germany. And in some ways, the US has more extreme stances, and in some ways, Germany has more extreme stances. But it does seem like at this moment, there's a merging of these ideas, because while there's always been this bipartisan American political consensus in favor of whatever Israel decides it wants to do, and there has been the same cancel culture that you've described under both Democrats and Republicans of academics and others, and we're seeing it now in a more naked way, but it's been there. And I wanted to ask you, in the aftermath of October 7th and the initiation of the genocidal war, walk me through some of how the German state responded to its residents when they protested, talking about, criminalization of speech or assembly. Give us some examples of the kinds of cases you've worked on and the trends that you've seen.
Yeah, so maybe before I do that, I think it's very important, and I keep repeating it whenever I speak publicly. We always have to remember that this didn't start on October 7th, but October 7th made it worse, because the response was by the German state to October 7th was basically the enforcement of, I think Michael Ratner from the CCR coined this phrase, the Palestine exception to free speech. They basically enforced the Palestine exception to free speech on every level. In the days and weeks after October 7th, there were bans of demonstrations, of pro-Palestinian demonstrations in basically all German cities. I think the most extreme example is Hamburg. In Hamburg, from 15 October till the 8th of December 2023, there was a general directive by the city that banned any pro-Palestinian demonstration. Jeremy, you have to see this. For almost 2 months, it wasn't possible for people in Hamburg to go to the streets and peacefully protest, to grieve, to shout out their anger. And the same we saw in Berlin. In Berlin, they didn't use this broad brush approach where they just banned everything, but they banned all the individual demonstrations. So people kept registering protest after protest. It was banned again and again. And sadly, the courts held up those prohibitions of demonstrations. So we saw an absolute abuse of assembly law in order to make it impossible for people to exercise their right to go out on the street and stand up for Palestine, voice their anger over Israel's action. And all this was justified by saying that those demonstrations pose a threat to security and safety. And a lot of times they used racist tropes, like saying that especially young Arab men are emotionalized by what's happening in Gaza, and therefore there's the danger that they commit acts of violence. But what was also used to ban these demonstrations was the risk of so-called speech offenses, that people would shout from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and that in the eyes of the German state constitutes basically a crime, because they are saying that then you are supporting what happened on October 7th. And they're also saying that this is a slogan by Hamas, and Hamas is a terrorist organization. So if you use that slogan, you are using the slogan of a terrorist organization, which is punishable in Germany by section 86A of the criminal code. So they started banning those demonstrations, and it took a while until it was possible to go out into the streets in Germany for pro-Palestine issues. But then those demonstrations were met with police violence, and they were heavily surveilled, and obviously, and here I come to the second pillar of repression, heavily criminalized. As you mentioned in your intro, Jeremy, there are several thousand criminal procedures in Berlin alone. Imagine that. There are several thousand people who have criminal charges leveled against them for their participation in protests, for what they shouted there, or where they, and with a very aggressive police, are accused of resisting an arrest, which can be anything like moving your arm slightly when a police officer violently arrests you doesn't lead to the police officer being charged. It leads to you being in front of the criminal court here in Berlin because you supposedly resisted a police officer. And so what we saw later on in late 2023 is that criminal law was more and more used in order to crack down on the pro-Palestine movement. I remember one particular case where the police violently searched a social center in Berlin-Wedding, northern Berlin, and a cafe, like a beautiful cafe called Karanfil in the district of Neukölln. And they did so because of the flyer of a leftist feminist youth organization that called, and the flyer basically called for the support of the Palestinian resistance, especially its progressive forces. So this was a young feminist group made up of mostly migrant women who spoke out in favor of progressive elements of the Palestine liberation movement. And two places of where people meet, get together, have cultural events, were raided by the police. So criminal law was used heavily in order to crack down on activism in general, but also concretely on free speech. And I just want to stick to that point maybe one bit longer, because I think it's incredible that the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" by the German state is considered to be illegal. We obviously have a lot of court cases. We are fighting this. This hasn't gone up all the way to the highest criminal court or the constitutional court, so it's still in the lower courts. And we also achieved some positive decisions where a judge from Mannheim in May 2024 made it clear that this phrase has multiple meanings. And one of the possible meanings is that people who shout that advocate for human rights for everyone in the region. However, the German government, the police, the state prosecutors still are of the opinion that if you shout that phrase, that you're calling for the extinction of all Jewish life between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, which if you ask any historian who is somehow serious about his profession, would tell you this is laughable. This is a joke. However, Germany sticks to that. So we saw the use of criminal law in order to crack down on this movement constantly since the start of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And so I think we will come back on the free speech issue. I want to mention that also what the German government did on 2nd of November 2023 was they banned two organizations. They banned Hamas in Germany, and they banned an organization, Samidun, which is a organization that exists in several countries where they are also criminalized now, and they support Palestinian prisoners, which I think is a very noble thing to do, because as we know from international reporting, there are thousands and thousands of people, of Palestinian prisoners taken hostage by the Israeli state who linger in their prisons and suffer gross human rights violations. However, the German state also banned Samidun and then attached more repression to it. And this is where I would come to what's happening in migration law later on.
Yeah, I want to ask you specifically about that. Just one other thing on this matter of speech. I mean, I've followed closely what's happening, the news reporting on it, also activists posting about what's happening. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there are people who literally have been cited for criminal violations just on the basis of the words that they're saying. I mean, you're mentioning from the river to the sea, but also comparing the conduct of the Israeli government to the conduct of the forces of the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler has also been criminalized. That it is not allowed in Germany to compare Israel's actions to the actions of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, so this is crazy. So I've represented in those cases, and I'm currently also representing clients who are accused of hate crimes because they have called what's happening in Gaza a Holocaust. So they are accused of taking a horrible historical event and comparing it to something that's happening right now, which is horrible. And making this comparison in the eyes of a lot of state prosecutors is basically diminishing the horrors of the Holocaust. That's how they argue. They say, if you compare what's happening in Gaza right now to the Holocaust, you're making fun of the Holocaust. And so I have ongoing cases about this in Bavaria. Actually, some good news on this. And the second highest criminal court in Berlin last year decided in our favor. And I think their argumentation on this is good and should be followed by every court, because they said if Holocaust is A and is horrible, and if what's happening in Gaza is B and is also horrible, you cannot possibly say that comparing A to B is saying that A is not bad. It's pure logic. However, this has not gotten through at all, especially in public opinion and the media, but also in the offices of judges, state prosecutors, and the police. So any comparison that you draw, any historic parallel that you draw, you are in danger of being criminally persecuted.
And just to be clear, among the people who have been charged with these anti-Semitic hate speech charges are Jewish people themselves.
Yes, I'm representing
citizens of Israel.
Yeah, I'm representing yesterday I received an indictment for an Israeli citizen who is accused of calling a police officer an anti-Semite when the police officer was arresting him at a pro-Palestine demonstration. So my client called this police officer an anti-Semite, but also is accused of using terrorist symbols by shouting the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." This is an Israeli citizen, it's a Jewish person, and I think the audacity of police officers and state prosecutors here in Germany to tell them what's anti-Semitic and what's not is beyond belief. It's beyond belief.
Well, and as you well know, I mean, we're seeing this exact same dynamic in the United States, where recently Trump Tower in New York City was subjected to a massive demonstration led by Jewish Voice for Peace, and you had hundreds and hundreds of Jewish Americans nonviolently occupying Trump Tower, and then the coverage of it on Trump-aligned media was that it was an anti-Semitic protest. I mean, this is one of the glaring elephants in the room of this entire narrative, is that many Jews in Germany or in the United States have been some of the most militant people opposing the conduct of Israel and saying that the state of Israel is not the religion of Judaism. And yet, to have the German government of all entities charging Jewish people with speech crimes because they are protesting against the genocidal action of a state that is regularly portrayed by the United States and Germany as sort of equivalent to the Jewish faith is an obscene outrage. Obscene outrage.
It makes me feel deeply ashamed, to be honest. It makes me feel deeply ashamed. And also, I want to mention another incident. So, in April of 2024, committed activists, Jewish Voice for Peace, other leftist groups, and non-aligned people tried to organize a Palestine Congress in Berlin. So they wanted to join the tradition of the student movement of the 1960s, who back then in the late 60s organized a so-called Vietnam Congress, which was a huge departure for the anti-war movement in the late 60s. So they tried to do this regarding Palestine. And it was organized in part by Jewish activists, and the propaganda by the German state and by the corporate media leveled against this was insane. They were called anti-Semites. They were being accused of spreading hate and fear, and that this wouldn't be safe. And in the end, the police raided the whole thing and shut it off. And that's where also people were arrested. And some of the people that were arrested that day were Jewish activists who were fighting alongside Palestinians and others for a democratic and human rights-based future in the region and for their civil rights in Germany. So I'm deeply ashamed as a German when I see those actions and the audacity of German authorities to decide what can be said and what cannot be said on that topic.
Yeah, you know, my friend Ali Abu Nima from Electronic Intifada, who also has had his own problems in Europe. He was recently detained in Switzerland. He's also been targeted in other countries as well, including Germany, where he was giving a speech remotely, and it was it was shut down. And then I encourage people actually to watch the speech that he ended up giving about that, because for many, many years, Ali has been making the point that if you boil down what is Germany's policy, Germany is punishing the Palestinian people for its own historical crimes. And if you reject the framing of this as Israel equals Judaism, and you look at it on a purely factual level, what we're witnessing is the United States and Germany bankrolling, arming, giving political and legal support to an entity that has a genocidal agenda, a war of annihilation agenda, but is also an apartheid state. It is very clearly an apartheid state. And so if you understand it in that factual context, and you reject the attempt to conflate criticism of Israel as a military state and with a religion of Judaism, then you can have an honest discussion about what is the actual policy here. So on the part of both the United States and Germany, what we're witnessing is financing the apartheid state abroad, financing its war of annihilation against the Palestinian people, and then at home, continuing to defend that apartheid state by taking away the civil liberties or civil rights of your own people, including Jewish people who are opposing that policy. That's what this boils down to. But I also think it's important to point out that the biggest victims of these policies in Germany and in the United States are Palestinians themselves, are Arabs themselves, who are being targeted. And there are so many cases that haven't even come to public light because of the way that media control, the broader media report on this, control the narrative. I mean, I'm sickened by American media coverage of the war in Gaza, but even the barons of propaganda in the United States would blush at how outrageous and obscene the media coverage has been in Germany. If you look at Bild, I think is the biggest newspaper in Germany, and the comments of its editors and the portrayal of Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians, the almost gleeful cheering on of this genocidal war, the constant portrayal of that Israel is going after the terrorists when we see decapitated children on a daily basis, limbs blown off. I mean, I never expected to see something worse than American media coverage of this, and I've seen it in Germany. It is outrageous, and it tries to normalize the very attacks that you're fighting against. And I want you to talk about how this sort of series of laws and actions by Germany have impacted Arab and Muslim residents of Germany, specifically Palestinians, but in a broader sense, the Arab and Muslim populations in Germany.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I think that is something very, very important to talk about, because the media in Germany is not willing to really take this up, to do their job and report on this. So I think it's really important that we have the chance to speak about this. So if we look at the criminalization of protest and the police violence, what we see is that it mostly affects non-white people, and mostly people of Palestinian descent, of Arab descent, and a lot of women who are wearing hijab. So the police acts very openly racist, and when they are surveilling the pro-Palestine movement when it comes to action in the streets. That's one point. But I think the bigger point, and I think what a lot of German society, the legal community, and journalists are not understanding, is that the weaponization of migration law against the pro-Palestine movement is one of the biggest civil rights issues that we have in Germany. Because what we have seen is an outrageous use of migration law against Palestinians and against Arab people. And I just want to give some examples. Let me be clear on this, Jeremy. I could talk now for 3 hours and we wouldn't be finished if I would tell you all the cases that we have seen on this. But I'll try to sum it up for the listeners and viewers out there, and then hope that they will continue to inform themselves on the issue. I think one of the most racist and incredibly measures taken by the German governments against people from Gaza is that after October 7, any asylum decision on people who have fled Gaza and came to Germany was frozen. Germany is using section 24, chapter 5 of the Asylum Act in order to do so. And this law says that if the situation in the country of origin is unclear and needs further examination in order to see whether a person merits protection or not after having applied for asylum, you can freeze the asylum request and basically not decide on it until the situation becomes clear. And for the last 17 months now, since October 7th, Germany has done this. Germany actually claims repeatedly, on and on again, says that the situation in Gaza is unclear, and we don't know whether those people should get refugee status. That is unbelievable. There's nothing to go back to for them but the genocidal war of Israel against their people. And Germany is denying those people the right of asylum, which they are clearly entitled to. And the government does so, even though there are already more than 100 administrative court decisions who say otherwise, who say, no, the situation is not unclear. You have to decide. Even the judges have understood this. But the German government is denying people from Gaza its right to asylum. And I think that's a shame for this country. And the shame connected to that is that that has been completely underreported. And also NGOs and other organizations working in migration took very long to take this topic up. And this, as a migration lawyer, also for my profession, fills me with grief and confusion. Like, what are we talking about? Of course, these people deserve asylum and refugee protection here in Germany. Also, citizenship law has been used in order to repress dissent and pro-Palestine speech. As you mentioned in the beginning, there were changes in the legislation. One federal state, the state of Saxony-Anhalt, made it into their law that you have to recognize the right of Israel to exist in order to receive citizenship. On the federal level, in the citizenship law, that was not introduced, but they introduced a clause which requires you to recognize, if you want to become a German citizen, it requires you to recognize the German responsibility for Jewish life, which, if you read it on paper, is not a bad thing. I would share that, but obviously they introduced it in order to deny the citizenship to Palestinians and Arabs who have voiced anti-Zionist beliefs. And actually the administrative court in Regensburg, which is in Bavaria, already made a decision that said that if you have made anti-Zionist statements, in the past that you then don't meet the threshold. And so they're keeping people away from German citizenship. And now in the new coalition and negotiations between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats who will form the new German government after the elections, they are discussing that double passport holders can lose their German citizenship if they are anti-Semites, whatever that means. But unfortunately, we know what it means for the state of Germany. It's the criticism of Israel. We've also seen more repression aimed against Palestinian and Arabs. So we have seen the revocation of residencies by people who voiced their support for the Palestine liberation movement in general on social media, and people who shared the phrase "from the river to the sea" on social media, people who commented on a military combat between Israeli forces entering Gaza and Palestinian fighters resisting those Israeli forces. And they were also accused of posing a threat to the security of Germany and therefore had their residency revoked. And we also saw the withdrawal of refugee statuses for Palestinians, especially here in Berlin. There was a wave of withdrawal of the refugee status of people. So we're talking here about people who the German state itself recognized as refugees at one point, and then takes away that protection because they people were accused of having some sort of ties to the organization I mentioned earlier called Samidun, the Prisoner Solidarity Network for Palestinians imprisoned by the state of Israel. And if you had any connection with them, they would withdraw your refugee status. So we had people who visited 2 or 3 demonstrations where supposedly activists of Samidun were present, and that was enough in order to strip them of their refugee status.
Yeah.
And yes,
go ahead. Go ahead. You could finish that last point.
So the last point is that all those measures in asylum law, in citizenship law, in residency law, those are measures that do not target people like me who have a German passport. Those are specifically aimed at Muslim people, at Arab people, and especially Palestinians. And Jeremy, one thing, I think that is very important to understand. If you receive a criminal fine and you have to pay a little money to the state or you get a small probation, you can carry on with your life. If they revoke your residency and you have nowhere to go, you end up in a legal limbo. That is worse than a criminal conviction. And the German state plays into this just now.
You know, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you, and I wanted people who subscribe to DropSite and read our work to hear this, is because we're seeing, so everything you're describing there is what is starting now to be rolled out in the United States. I mean, you are describing also the intensification of these policies in the U.S. It's not that much of what you've described hasn't existed in some form or another in the United States. It's that we're starting to see a systemization of it in the United States, where you're having people facing deportation because of what for more than 250 years has been considered constitutionally protected speech in the United States. This idea that, Donald Trump wants to amend the U.S. Constitution without actually amending the U.S. Constitution. They want to strip due process rights from people without actually going through the very complicated, difficult process of amending the Constitution. This is very dangerous. And I feel like part of what we get from listening to you, Alex, is a sense of where this is headed in our own country as well, in the United States as well. And I want to ask you, there's been focus on Mahmoud Khalil's case, and there should be. And part of the focus has been around the fact that he's a legal permanent resident of the United States, a green card holder. His wife any day now, who is going to give birth to their child. His wife is a US-born American citizen. Mahmoud Khalil was convicted of no crimes, and he was kidnapped from his apartment building, disappeared for a period of time, and then eventually we learned that he was sent to a notorious immigration detention facility in the southern US state of Louisiana. But part of the reason why there's been a lot of focus on his case was that it was one of the first high-profile cases, but also it was because he has a green card. You are representing people with a variety of residency statuses in Germany. And recently, there are clients of yours whose case became public there was reporting on this in The Intercept, in the Irish media, a lot of it in the German media over the past week. But you're representing, you and others, you're not the only lawyer working on this, 3 EU citizens, 2 of them from Ireland, 1 from Poland, and then also an American citizen. And these cases have gotten a lot of media attention. And there's a kind of analogy with the EU citizens to Mahmoud Khalil in this sense. In the European Union, people have freedom of movement. If you are a citizen of one European Union country, you have the right to live in any European Union country. And the bar for banning people from taking up residency in another European Union country, it's a very, very high bar to meet if you want to say, no, this person is not allowed to live in our society. Right? You can explain the legality of it. But this case is, I want to just emphasize this to people. We're talking about European citizens. Most of the targeted people do not fall into this category, but it's relevant because it shows the extremes that are now being gone to in both the United States and in Germany to try to punish and deter any activism that challenges the state policy of support for this genocidal war. So give us a sense of who your clients are in this case, the kinds of charges that they face. None of them, I understand, have been convicted of a crime in Germany, but what the German government is alleging and why they're saying these people, they wanted people by April 21st.
So, Jerry, let me start by giving a small overview of the case before I then jump into, I think, the point that you rightfully mentioned, which is why those 4 are getting the attention that Arabs and Palestinians haven't gotten. So first, let me talk about the case. So we have 4 young people who have been very active in the pro-Palestine movement and who by mid-March received expulsion orders where they were asked by the Berlin Migration Office to leave the country by 21st of April. So this case became that public because of the way the procedure before the expulsion orders were issued happened. So those people have criminal procedures going against them for their participation in pro-Palestine protests. So they participated in sit-ins and demonstrations and in an attempted occupation of the Freie University in Berlin on 17th of October. And the Berlin Senate and its mayor, Kai Wegner, wanted to show strength against the pro-Palestine movement and wanted to make a real clear stance that they use every measure available to them to crack down on it. And so they asked the Migration Office to issue deportation orders against those 4. None of them have been convicted of a crime. And regarding the attempt of the occupation of the university, we as criminal defense lawyers haven't even seen the files. The Migration Office then, after being asked to end the residency of those 4 people, got back to the Berlin Senate in the form of the Department of the Interior and said, regarding the EU citizens, we cannot do this. This would be illegal. EU law and its implementation to German law requires a criminal conviction. And then, 1st of January this year, a person working at the Department of the Interior of the Berlin Senate replied to them, no, we overrule this. We think you have to do this. Please go ahead and do this. And a couple of weeks later, we received deportation orders on the 4 of them, which we think in the case of the 3 EU nationals are clearly politically motivated and illegal because none of them have been convicted. And the criminal case that ties them, the attempt of the university occupation, we haven't even seen the files yet. And we think that the arguments brought forward by the Migration Office itself show the political motivation because our clients are wrongfully accused of spreading anti-Semitism, of indirectly supporting Hamas. And then I think an astonishing thing happened in this case. This is the first time I've seen it, that a German authority said, we have to end your residency because the reason of state, Staatsräson, which we spoke about in the beginning of the segment, requires us to do this. And also in the case of the US citizen, we think that is clearly illegal even though in the case of third country nationals, such as the US, you don't need necessarily a criminal conviction in order to end the residency, but it still has to be proportional. In the case of the US citizen, there's just one criminal case, the attempted occupation of the university, where we still haven't received the files. So we decided to go public with the case because we felt that we could document how political power was leveled in order to issue those deportation orders, something that unfortunately, I, as a lawyer who has worked a lot on this, could not do in any other case over the last 17 months. And this has made quite a splash in German media. It was a discussion in the Berlin parliament. There's a discussion, a lot of members of parliament of the federal parliament have spoken out about this one way or the other. So there's a very lively debate around this. But I think that we should not forget, and it's also something that is very important to the four affected people of this case. It's very important not to forget the people who suffer most under the weaponization of migration law in Germany these days are Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. However, this case is the one that got public because we had the information how political power was leveled. Now we took it to the Berlin Administrative Court. And to be honest, we're very confident that in this case, the judges have to side with us because the law is very clear.
Yeah, I want to ask. I want to back up to something you said there and really make sure people understand this. Do I understand that what you're saying is that the German prosecutors are arguing that essentially it's necessary to deport them to protect Israel?
Their argument is that they are a threat to the safety and security of Germany foremost, but then they bring into this argumentation that say that because they pose this danger, the Staatsräson requires this harsh measure. So they bring it in as an argument in order to end the residency.
And again, Staatsräson, as you've described, yes, it's not necessarily a legal doctrine, but the point of it is to say that a reason for the existence of the state of Germany is to defend the state of Israel.
Exactly. And that's what they're openly arguing. And actually, I think that's very interesting because I think today, Kai Wegner, the mayor of Berlin, was asked by the press what he thought of those 4 deportations orders. And he literally said that those who question the right of Israel to exist should expect such measures. So he also made it very clear that the reason why those 4 people now are being targeted is because they are standing in the way of Germany implementing its reason of state. And also the other cases I have seen affecting Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, they didn't dare to argument that openly, but I think also it is because they know that they can get away with a lot more if you're targeting marginalized groups. Here they did it to 4 activists who are very well connected, who have a very good legal team, which is not just me, but also 4 other lawyers who are absolutely incredibly and doing incredible work and are absolutely brilliant. And so we achieved to make this case that big. But for us, especially for the clients, it's very important to mention that this is something that the German government is doing, the Berlin government is doing in order to show strength and to show that it can happen to anyone. And they want to spread fear among people who don't have a German passport.
Right. And we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to mention there were recent elections in Germany. The conservative CDU party won more votes than anyone else. It seems like they're making this coalition government with the outgoing party that was in control, the Social Democrats. But there was a record-setting performance at the ballot box of the AfD, which is characterized as a far-right party. But I feel like it's important to remind people that everything that Alex is talking about took place not under a government that was characterized as far right, but under governments that were considered traditional conservative governments, traditional liberal governments in the American political context. And this is not that the far right won elections and started doing this. This is the mainstream of German political thinking, that this speech should be criminalized, that Israel should be given weapons to fight its war of annihilation against the Palestinians, and that citizens who are living in Germany, regardless of their residency status, should face criminalization of their attempts to dissent from their own government's policy. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is completely right. And I think that is the alarming thing, that the migration policy, the militarization that is going on in Germany, trying to get society ready for another war in Germany, the national security legislation, the shift to the right doesn't require the far right to be in power. It is happening already, and it happened under, like you correctly said, under the liberal government by the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberal Party. They pushed through the harshest migration legislation in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. They are the ones who targeted pro-Palestinian activists, and now the conservatives can build up on that. And just a mention of this, Beatrix von Storch, which is one of the most prominent members and most radical fascist members of the AfD, saluted the decision to issue the deportation order against those four. So what we're up against Germany is a whole establishment who is enacting deeply racist and dangerous policies.
Yeah. Well, Alex Gorski, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I really encourage people to pay close attention to the kinds of cases that Alex is fighting here, because this is now also at the center of what's going on in the United States. And as I said at the beginning, it's a two-way street. Germany has adopted American-style politics on this. Whether Trump is aware of it or not, he really is formalizing an embrace of the Staatsräson mentality right now as he's waging his war against free speech, freedom of assembly, and due process. Alex Gorski is a Berlin-based criminal defense and migration lawyer. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy.
You can also look up Alex's work and check out the work of his law firm that he is a partner at, and we'll link to all of this on our website. He's also a member of that legal team that's currently fighting the deportation of these 3 EU citizens and an American citizen from Germany in retaliation for their activism against Germany's support and facilitation of Israel's genocidal war. That does it for this program. You can support our work by going to dropsitenews.com and becoming a subscriber. If you don't have the financial means to become a paid subscriber, that's okay. The best thing you can do is spread the word about our journalism. We have reporters who are inside of Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere that are taking tremendous risks. I also want to remember our colleague, Hossam Shabbat, who was assassinated by Israeli forces. More than 200 of our Palestinian colleagues working in media have been killed in a systematic assassination and mass killing campaign unleashed by Israel against journalism and journalists and many family members of those journalists. If you do have the means to support us, you can pay for a subscription. We're also a 501c3 nonprofit. You can make a tax-deductible donation to support the work of Dropsite News. Thanks so much to all of our listeners, our readers, our viewers. We know you have our back, and it means the world to us. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill.